obviously, for purposes of this. Thank you to all the three of you, of course, and Mr. McGinnis that couldn't be here tonight. But thank you, obviously, for your service. This is a new experience, and this is the first actual substantive meeting of this board. I think, and that's true for all of us, not just for the three of you. And what I will indicate, at the risk of repeating myself from earlier, what I'll indicate is that obviously the experience here will be determinative of how we conduct all our meetings in the future. We'll learn from this, as well as obviously we have this ordinance that council has passed. This, for all intents and purposes, it was a theoretical exercise because there had never been a process before, and this is the process. And I think our experiences here in this board will also probably determine, this board may make recommendation for modifications, improvements, additions, deletions, corrections, whatever they may be, of that ordinance. And I think so I hope that as we go forward, you will consider all, you'll keep a mental note of all that you do and with respect to going forward and addressing these issues. There's a couple of complaints that have been filed. We submitted to you, administration sent to you, obviously, copies of the complaints that were made, as well as items that were associated with those complaints. At the same time, obviously, the ordinance has been up. Hopefully you've reviewed it, you're familiar with it. If not, part of the way I would imagine that this would play, this would work over the course of, the consideration of these complaints will be that the determinations that this board will make will be whether the alleged violations meet the standard and violate the standard that City of Clawson has enacted by way of its ordinance. And that's a determination that that requires some thought and deliberations from all of the board members. In reviewing the complaints, there's many, in our ethics ordinance, it states that this board will determine a lot of things for itself, its officers, its policies, its procedures, and obviously in many respects they haven't been, because we haven't had any substantive complaints before, they have not been materialized other than the officers. You've selected the officers with Mr. McGinnis being chair and Ms. Fenton being vice chair. The nature the nature of the complaints that you received and the substantive complaints that you received dealt with actions that were taken during council meetings for the most part. I imagine as you deliberate with respect to these complaints, you may have this board may have a wish to see additional documentation, minutes from prior meetings of council, perhaps a review video, things of that nature, whatever they may be, whatever you will need in order to effectuate your decision making and inform your decision making. Whatever those items are, obviously we're committed, within the parameters of the law to provide you all that you need. Consideration of those items, or I should say deliberation on any item, will have to be in an open meeting. We're governed by the Open Meeting Act. Mm-hmm. So all that will have to take place here. Other than that, I think that's my sort of general overview. The remainder, the consideration of this will be up to you. It depends on whether you've had the opportunity to review all the materials that was sent and you deem it, enough for you to be able to start considering and making determinations, or whether you wish to simply receive this information for today's purposes and then request additional information, or simply take more time and return back and schedule another time where other members to be present to be able to make the determination. I think in my mind those are the steps probably that make sense, the decisions that need to be made for today's purposes.
To be clear, the requirements under the Open Meetings Act, does that also, is the information within the complaint also to be made public, or is that to be kept confidential?
Thank you so much for bringing that up. That's one of the items that council will need to address, as a matter of fact. In the ethics ordinance that we have, there's a couple of statements in one provision of it that actually are, whether somebody observing it or would realize or not, they're contradictory. On the one hand, it states that the information shall be kept strictly confidential. And then the sentences that follow talk about the person that's been accused of an ethical complaint have to have, having due process rights, right? And having the right to, basically, to be informed of what they've been accused of. Those are contradictory statements by definition. And the Open Meetings Act, obviously, presides over this entire affair. And we cannot, despite our most sincere wish, and I think that was probably aspirational of, thank you. To me, for me as an attorney, it's probably aspirational language on account of counsel there with respect to confidentiality. But that needs to be clarified. I'm glad, obviously, even though somebody looking at this particular, the events or whatever it may be that led them here, that led to these complaints, may have wished to have these matters be kept confidential. Unfortunately, cannot be. Certainly the subject matter doesn't allow for it, not the topic of this complaint, not the sum total of events of this complaint, but overall they wouldn't be, and overall there would be very limited circumstances where we, pursuant to law, would be able to maintain such information strictly confidential.
Mm-hmm. So does that impact our ability to speak freely regarding?
No, in my opinion, it does not. The information, I think my interpretation of that provision is that with respect to these events and everything that has transpired here, because this was all, these were all events that happen in public, right? And for the most part, it dealt with public matters. There's nothing to prevent this board from speaking publicly about it. The individuals involved, everything about it.
I don't know how you guys want to proceed in terms of.
Well, if there's A and B, and in reviewing of the complaint, I mean the complaints are, somewhat linked, and to talk about them individually, there might be quite a bit of overlap there. So, I mean, maybe, I guess, kind of talk about it in, one situation, so to speak. That's maybe a recommendation.
I agree. Yeah, sorry. And I have to just say that I wasn't aware of the meeting until last night, and so I got the information, the packet last night too, so I've had a chance to look it over, but not in extreme detail. So I will defer to other people's reading of this, but I think we could just open it up for an open conversation.
Yeah.
And then at that point, we can ask some recommendations from the city attorney about next steps.
Okay. Yeah, I was in the same boat as far as getting this yesterday, but I did have a chance to review it. I mean, there's a lot here to kind of unpack, but, and I guess we're allowed to speak freely about, the contents of this. I think it kind of boils down to, it's not really spelled out here, but it kind of boils down to, an allegation that the firing of the city manager was, unethical and perhaps based on bias or potentially retribution for him having fired the Hodges superintendent. And then the then act to reinstate the Superintendent Hodges with paid leave pending a review of his termination it seems the allegations here that was unethical to do. I mean, there's a lot here, but in my opinion, that seems to what this really kind of ends up boiling down to.
The sum of it, right? I agree with that. I think I have a couple questions because I really was not super familiar with all of these incidences that took place, of course, until I read this. One of my questions was, and I don't know that we know the answer to it, but the timeline states that Hodges was arrested in March, I believe, of 2020. And yes, that's the first line. But he was not fired until August? And I guess I just was wondering, like, some clarification of that, if we know those answers, why, like, what's the lapse in the termination of that, and what was the reasoning behind that? That was a question that I had to kind of really, for me to be able to make a full, conclusion of whether this was an ethical decision being made.
Yeah. I know it does say that he was sentenced in November, so that's, and I think that the part of this is that, the sentence for the DUI or what have you was, in large part, part of why he was terminated. The sentence coming in November, and then ultimately his termination was, I think, in August, correct?
So that's a really long time.
So that's, so what happened between then and his termination, I don't know. And it also doesn't mention the reason for his termination. So one's to suspect that this DUI seemed to have at least some part of it, because a part of the sentence was suspended licenses and, but did that affect his ability to perform his job? Did he receive any kind of a performance evaluation? Did he have job objectives that weren't lived up to? What led to the city manager firing the superintendent? You don't know.
But what was it based on?
Yeah, what was it based
his
on?
logic and reasoning behind it? Was there something in Hodges's contract that stated if A, B, and C are fulfilled, then you're terminated based on those fulfillments, or, breach of your contract, or these are our rules and you broke them and you're not allowed to have a DUI working in that position?
And it also referenced in the complaint here a couple former or current city employees that had similar issues, but it's referenced that Matt's issue was worse because it mentions what his blood alcohol was and what his sentence ended up being, but it's alluding that the other two situations were still drunk driving, but maybe not as bad, but it doesn't necessarily say, well, what was their blood alcohol, or does that even matter with respect to the termination?
Well, right. Well, that's what brought me back to what was the reasoning for him being fired. Like, if you have to hold a valid driver's license to do his job, and then he no longer had that valid driver's license, so maybe, but I don't want to speculate. I want to know what the reasoning was behind that. Because I could understand that then. Mm-hmm. And the other gentlemen didn't lose their license completely based on their reporting, which I did not look up those actual, I was just taking this, we would have to actually dig into their actual, I guess, get those documentations to prove what he was saying was true about the other two city workers.
It also seems like, one of the primary allegations is that the decision to reinstate him with pay pending a review by the interim city manager, because there's lack of clarity as to why Hodges was fired in the first place, without, that seems like that actually would be an appropriate decision to make, if I don't know, I don't know if that's within the purview of council but he had recently been terminated, and maybe there wasn't a lot of documentation or reason why, and they, reinstated him pending a review.
I mean, that is a question that came up for me too in the review, is because this relates so closely to a personnel action, how much of that information are we privy to, if any? And do we need to move on to a separate piece of evidence to make our decision?
Yeah, and obviously, this will be, by definition, always somewhat difficult to approach. And I have a couple of recommendations, and my recommendations, of course, are legal in nature with respect to the factual questions. We'll provide you, I'm keeping copious notes, and then, through the clerks, we'll provide you actual documentation for you to be able to establish whatever timeline you seek, so that you move above and beyond just simply allegations, but to make certain factual findings. But if I have a recommendation, will be, obviously you need to, and I really appreciated Mr. McCullough stating exactly, narrowing down exactly the basic allegation that comes at the forefront, distilled down from the larger complaint, obviously, which contained a lot of information. But as we distill down the nature of the basic complaint, then we keep a narrow focus on the actual complaint to try to make the determination. I think that will be important for purposes of the board, because otherwise the more you expand the scope, it'll be unmanageable. At one point or another, it'll be unmanageable, and obviously it'll deal with employee considerations that perhaps are far afield. But to the extent that they guide your decision making, of course, we'll provide you whatever documentations that you seek.
Yeah, the other, one of the primary allegations, before that was, the firing of the city manager in the first place, which, was that, a retaliatory nature with regard to him having fired Hodges. It says in here that, there was a performance, the Hodges was fired, or the communications firing was on 8/6. And then the performance evaluation for the city manager is an 8/10, which I believe there's a weekend in there. So, it talked about how there were, 60 different items in that evaluation, of which only a handful had been, properly, completed based on, I guess his objectives. So, I guess that leads, again, with was that firing or determination to terminate, was that unethical, or, were the, complaints or things brought in that performance evaluation, valid? Was it made up, or, what were the, and I mean, obviously they went through the evaluation and they had voted and decided to terminate. But at least with regard to that decision, there is documentation which supports that termination, whereas at least what we have in front of us, that's lacking with regard to Hodges. So,
From my understanding also, the real thing is the complainant, I should say, Mr. McDonald, is really getting at that there's obviously friendships outside of, the realm of city council and all that. It's personal friendships, and whether or not this is, I don't, for better use of words, cahoots together, trying to pretty much manipulate a situation. I mean, I think that's really the gist of his complaint, honestly, and whether or not that's ethical based on their friendship, that these decisions were made in the order in which that they were made. So, I mean, that's something that, again, I was looking at. I'm like, I don't know the legalities of who can be friends, or, I mean, obviously we live in America, we can be friends with whomever we choose, but the proper protocol and within the guidelines of the law, and I don't know that what they were doing was unethical based on any laws or guidelines that they've been given in their positions. So for that, I would need some, based on the complaint, I would say it was probably, but I want to know, like,
Certainly.
legally
I
what
think,
that would be.
I think that's a perfect and a perfectly appropriate consideration, because at the end of the day, the consideration that this board will have is not whether you agree with it, or whether you agree with the complainant or not, or whether you find the behavior involved ethical or unethical, but only whether you find the behavior alleged violated our ordinance.
Right.
Right, and that's a different kind of consideration. does it violate the standard and the spirit of our ordinance? That's your determination at the end of the day. But to help, obviously, you're exactly correct that we'll talk about, again, I'm taking copious notes with respect to documents that you will need to receive and review ahead of time, as that obviously the city has. We'll provide those, and then, at whatever next meeting that we schedule with respect to this, we'll talk about, the legal standard based on, our ordinance itself.
I know, I mean, the ordinance, obviously, council members and certain people will have, the disclosure agreements that they have. And, those are more of, business relationships and things. It has nothing to do with any, friends or things, as far as I understand. Is that correct? So
That is correct.
there would be no reason to disclose, hey, I'm
We
friends
have-
with this person. And
Right,
they're-
we have nepotism, ordinances separate and distinct, and nepotism is mentioned in the ethics ordinance as well, obviously, as you may have noticed, but we do have other ordinances that will come into play that deal with nepotism. but
Does
other than that-
nepotism, that specifically speaks to family, though?
Correct.
Then not, okay.
Correct. But otherwise, no, there's nothing preventing as far as friendships, and I think that addresses your earlier comment as well.
This is something that I think reflects the fact that we've been building the ship
Yes.
as we've been
Yes.
sailing it. But I think what needs to happen in future is that we need to clarify our materials for the applicants to specify the specific nature of their claim and how it relates to the ordinance. Whether it be a tick all boxes that apply or write in other, because there are many, to your point, there are many different things going on here. And I see the one separate claim against Reese Scripture, but then there are other things that are incriminating in the claim against Louis Sampson, and it's not clear exactly how we're supposed to direct our attention.
I couldn't agree more, actually, and obviously the determination will be yours, but when I looked at it with my eyes, I thought exactly the same, and I thought, and to a certain extent, when we created earlier documents, I never thought that we would receive basically, but we should expect, obviously, you'll receive all sorts of documents. In my mind, I didn't think I would receive a stream of consciousness kind of document, but we need to plan for it, and the way we plan for it is by crafting documents. I mean, I know in law school we crafted documents on account of issue, rule, application, conclusion, and there's a way to guide the complainant, properly with respect to state-specific complaints. Have a paragraph with respect to that, and then go down to which provision of the ordinance do you believe it violates. Tell me briefly how. Excuse me. I think that's perfectly appropriate, and by next time we meet, we'll have that. The next, hopefully we'll never have any complaints, but the next complaint that we receive will be received in such fashion, I think.
I think too that, it's helpful to have the narrative. I like to hear it
Sure.
in the complainant's own words and own thought patterns, but I think we should have a separate form that then says, okay, identify issue number one, what is it? Who is the person that you're addressing, and which part of the ordinance do you believe to be in violation?
Yeah.
And then have them list for all of the issues that they want to bring about. Because I honestly don't know where we need to direct our attention. And there are things that are coming up to me that are not necessarily being put forth very clearly by the applicant, and I don't want to put words in their mouth about what the accusations are. So I think we need to be very careful about how we continue in this conversation, because I don't know what our remit is, and I don't want to overstep our bounds, but I don't want to make assumptions about what their intention was, because in both of the letters, what Mr. McDonald is saying is that it's not any one of these things, it's a compilation of all of these things, but I don't believe we can make a decision in that manner.
That's, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think your analysis, the method of analysis there is exactly correct. I think, for this board, and this board will operate in many ways just like any other board that we have, where we consider, a legal standard, or you consider the facts based on a legal standard. But I think I am inclined to agree. I think, more honed in process that doesn't do away with, obviously, the content of that letter that we'll see in the future as well. I think that makes sense. So if I hear this board correctly, and you're entitled to have all the conversation in the world, but and you're going to guide me with respect to that. If as far as if you think that these are this is a general area of documentation that you seek, we can compile that and bring that forward to you. And schedule another meeting where, and this time around, you won't be on a one-day notice, I promise.
We fixed the email issues.
Thank you. Yeah, so you'll receive, obviously, proper notice and the documents ahead of time for you to review, and maybe we can have a more meaningful conversation, obviously, going forward based on that.
One thing I want to point out as well, which I think we need to think ahead, is that because of the nature of this complaint specifically and the multiple meetings that are included in this, your role is present as well.
Yeah.
And so if our fact-finding leads us to information that pertains to you, I think we need to have somebody ready to advise this board that is not part of that process.
Certainly, makes sense.
So I don't know what we would need to do, but I think we need to prepare to have someone else be part of this, because I imagine that as we get to further down this, there's going to be conversation or requests for information that result in information that you were a part of.
Sure.
As for your role for council.
Yeah, but mind you, and you're absolutely right. And it's conceivable that's conceivable for any person dealing with, the affairs of this fair city, obviously. But nestled in your argument, I think there's one portion that I think we probably need to address now, that though it is a fact-finding expedition in many respects, in the ordinance itself is stated outright, and I think is the meaning behind the ordinance overall, that this is not an investigation, right? So the documents that we'll be providing to you are not to effectuate an investigation as to what happened, right? But only to establish, the factual scenario for you to be able to make a determination of whether the ethical complaint that was made violated our ordinance, right? So it states in the ordinance already that we're not going to do an investigation. We're not going to look into that. We're not going to subpoena information. We're not going to take testimony. This is not what this is. This is not the role of this board. And I think council was careful to craft it that way because of the probably the delicate nature of these issues. For example, just to think about it in certain terms, we deal with, we're in many respects, we're dealing with certain employment issues that will not be your purview in any way, shape, or form. You will not be able to affect them. So I think, that I just wanted to state that so that, that you're cognizant of it overall.
I agree. Is there an appeals process to this? If we were to make a finding, whatever that looks like, and people come back and say, that's fair, however, my reason for doing this was A, B, and C, is there an appeal process or whatever we say? Because I'm just thinking down the line, and I'll speak very clearly, is that I've been involved in city boards for a long time. I understand the decision-making procedures, and I can just anticipate that the next conversation is, we consulted the city attorney who said A, B, or C. And so I don't want us to make that thing and then get into a situation where we have to go back and review all these things.
All you're issuing at the end of the day is an opinion, right? So your opinion doesn't have, so the answer is no. It's an advisory opinion. It's an opinion that states, it could be as simple as, not as simple. It is as simple as, yes, you violated our ordinance. No, you did not violate our ordinance. The prosecuting attorney can take thereafter, right? Because as an attorney, we would have certain obligations, can take thereafter and prosecute based on that, opinion of yours, can take that, not necessarily dealing with your opinion, but can take on and prosecute a civil infraction, meaning, in our district court. And that has certain steps. That's where the appeals processes will go on. But as far as you're concerned, you're not holding anyone accountable. You're not making anybody whole. You're not, firing anybody, you're not throwing anybody down. There's none of that. At the end of the day, you're issuing an opinion. And it doesn't, in my mind, because we say you will draft your own, you create your own board, so to speak, rules, procedures, policies, your opinions could very well be, I don't know, something like, the Constitution, or not even the Constitution, but like the Declaration of Independence, but most likely it won't be anything substantive and as long and well-crafted, but it'll be a vote at the end of the day, right? Was there, a violation? When all the conversation has ceased, right, when we've talked about whatever issue to death, right, the five of you will eventually make a determination. And the determination will be, a question laid upon the table pursuant to Robert's Rules of Order. They'll say, was there a violation of our ordinance by, in this case we have two complainants, by re-scripture? Yeah. Roll call. There'll be a vote. That's your opinion. Right. So I think that's, in my mind, and I think it has to be that way. It wouldn't be able to be any other way that would make sense.
And
Well,
oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say, once the complaint is filed and presented, let's say, on the first meeting, we don't, come to a formal opinion, so let's say we say, hey, we request to have this or that, right? And then we'll meet on that. Now, the person or people making the complaint against the defendants or are they, do they then submit more, or is it like, hey, we're gonna get stuff that we specifically ask for based on this complaint? Like, will this complaint at any point be revised or added? The person bringing the complaint. Oh, well, we'll add this, and what about that? Or
I think it'll make a process cumbersome. There's nothing necessarily to prevent it, but that's ordinarily. No, we wouldn't go out there and revisit. Could we say to somebody, no, we will receive no more documents from you, sir or madam? No, we operate under the OMA, we operate under rules of, that all municipalities operate. So no, we won't be preventive in any way, shape, or form, I don't think. But ordinarily, no, we'll proceed forward. And when eventually, we've had a few of those, and hopefully not. But, if you've had a few of those, you've created a process that makes sense to this board, and you created some precedence that makes sense to this board. I think then it'll be a more, it'll be a well-oiled machine, hopefully, where we bring forth the information narrowly tailored and properly crafted for you to be able to review. You will know, you will have reviewed our ordinance. You will know that standard. The complainant itself, him or herself, will point to you what they think is the issue at hand. Even for us, they'll be helpful. For the city's administration, will be helpful, where we'll review and we'll perhaps ahead of time give you documents necessary that are publicly available for you to review, and you can hopefully get straight onto the conversation and the vote at the end.
So maybe the flip to that question is, will we be able to consider information that's not in the complaint?
Well, I think the answer to that is yes. There will be documents that I can conceivably foresee existing out there, publicly available, that you would be able to review. Certainly, you're not. So to answer your question directly, you're not contained within the four corners of that complaint. No.
Because I think this especially is tricky because, to your point, all of these allegations happen in a public setting.
Sure.
Some of us watch the meetings, so it's hard to
Well, you don't
include additional information.
Just like, and obviously I'm a creature of the court system, so I can say, just like we say in the court, you don't check your reason at the door, right? You don't check your life experiences, you don't check your knowledge base and your knowledge of this at the door. Obviously, we hope, I think like in any other board, you come in and you listen to the facts that are presented to you, and based on the information, you make a determination, but you'll have plenty of information that that you'll consider that guide your thoughts as a human, of course.
And is it available to complainants to come and speak in front of the board? Was that made available or not?
Well, public comment is available, obviously. So we're not in the sense of us, this board taking testimony. It's not set up that way. No, the answer to that is no. But obviously, and that's why when we crafted the agenda for this meeting, we put public comment front and center to that end. Anybody that wishes to, whether involved or not involved, has the ability to do so. Not doing so is just kind of like our legal standards in court. You're presumed to be innocent, right? There's presumed to be no violation whatsoever. We don't come here with a presumption. Simply because somebody makes an allegation, it means nothing. What it does mean is that this board will take it up, consider it, and make a determination at the end. But somebody may choose to speak, may choose not to speak. That's entirely their pleasure on either side of the equation.
What are your thoughts about, do we want to continue the conversation? Do we want to ask the complainant to come back with more directives?
I mean, personally, I think that, ultimately, whether we make a decision today or during next meeting, I think that I don't want to set a precedent where, we allow a complainant to, continue to come forward. Oh, well, sounds like they didn't like that, so let me go I think it's like if you're gonna push the button and submit the complaint, you should have, not to say that this doesn't, but I'm saying you should, in general, have your ducks in a row, your evidence should be there, and if there's certain questions specifically that we have, then, we could obtain that information, but, on either side, I don't think we want to turn this, into a situation where we can never finally, litigate something because people are constantly bringing in new information or.
I mean, personally, I think this being our first case, or whatever we call this, complaint, I think that we do need a little bit more information. I agree with going forward, having like the checkbox where it actually applies directly to the ordinance is a wonderful idea. I think that would be way more, I don't want to cut and dry a little bit. We can actually just pinpoint the exact complaint related directly to the ordinance. But I do think based on this is our first one and that we did not have that available, I think that there needs to be a little bit more information given to us in order to make our decision.
That makes sense. And as I indicated, we'll provide, obviously we've heard this conversation, so we'll provide you the factual documents publicly available with respect to those specific questions that you had as far as timeline. Absolutely.
And the specific actions, I think it'd be helpful if they were numbered out, right? So this issue would violate this part of the clause, and then the next issue, and I think it has to be very clear.
With respect to the forms down the road, are you saying?
Well, yeah, but I think also, that's what I'm looking for
This one, right.
For this one,
Just because
okay.
there are so many things,
Sure.
and the timeline is overlapping between the two complaints, and the actions are overlapping, I'm not sure exactly how we're supposed to direct our attention.
Sure. I'll be able to help you a little bit with respect to that. I think that's a proper legal area for me to guide your thinking without pushing you one way or another, just to say, I think this fits within this particular provision. This is what you ought to consider. I think that's perfectly fair.
And how far back are we going? Are we going, to your point, were there violations previously when Supervisor Hodges was not, where are we starting?
No.
Right.
And that's the sort of the fault with, the nature of the complaint being as broad as it is and not as targeted. You're exactly right. We're always going to err on the side of limiting and focusing and narrowing down, because that's the very purpose of this board. Otherwise, for you to review, it will be unmanageable, obviously, to be able to do so. So, narrowly tailored. It's a great, judges hold us to that standard in court all the time. I'm going to hold you to that standard. How's that?
So for the purposes of this case or these cases, should we, as the three of us agree upon what, we kind of opened with, hey, after going through all this, we think that these are kind of the two main allegations. And we're kind of making inference because it's not clearly spelled out. I mean, would you agree that, you know, that, first of all, that was accurate, that those are the main issues at hand here, with a lot of other things that led to them, you know, or you know, is it just not specific enough at all to narrow this down that way?
I don't know that, for me, I don't know that it is specific enough. And I'm starting to feel a little bit uncomfortable because I don't want to read too much of my own feelings into where I think, in this narrative, both of them, I'm starting to underline all these things that I think are violations of the ordinance, but I don't want to put my own words into the applicant's mouth. So this is where,
And with respect to that, I'll be able to help you a little bit, because there are some issues, and I don't want to be in the business of discounting anybody's arguments either, to be perfectly honest with you. There's no future benefit to that for anyone. And so I'll be very mindful of that. But I think there is, you know, a way for me, legally speaking, to say that, you know, a certain argument, factual or, legal as it may be in the complainant's document, is wholesale outside of the area of propriety for this board to be able to determine. And actually, I can sort of have my train of thought, follow my train of thought with you come next time. I'll put it in writing so that you review it, and you'll know ahead of time, and then I'll be able to give you the explanation as to why, and hopefully reduce it down to those key areas of concern, and literally do, you know, in sort of if-then statement format, meaning like, you know, this is alleged and it goes to this particular item in our ordinance, this is your consideration. And and I imagine if presented that way, even if I may be on this first one, more than one item, there'll be several items or areas of concern, right, alleged, you can still make the determination fairly quickly, hopefully, with respect to, well, you know, we're dealing with one factual scenario with one provision. And you can hopefully go down the line to be able to do so.
I'm stuck on the issue of how much information will we be privy to about this DPW supervisor's firing, because for me, that's foundational for everything else. If the firing was with cause or without cause, that then determines for me the ethics of all the actions that followed after it. But if we as a board aren't going to have the ability to know that information because it's a personnel matter, that becomes, for me, a block in being able to make informed decisions.
Well, but we are privy to maybe the specifics of his job description, and if there was one, and what the means of being terminated would be. Maybe they have that spelled out.
And maybe I can, you know, and I think,
I'm saying just like a basic document, like if you want to apply for this job, this is the requirements, and then come along with that is these are means of termination, or even within the job description, if you don't hold a valid driver's license, you don't qualify to apply for this job. It could be something like that.
Yeah, maybe I can assist a little better by telling you that, you know, Mr. Hodges' position with the city was an at-will employee, meaning there is no reason required for him to be terminated.
But he didn't have a contract.
I'm sorry?
He did not have a contract.
No, there's no contract for that position. So, you know, they may determine your decision-making. And again, this is, you know, the area where the complaint alleges a timeline that is larger perhaps than the focus needs to be. But nonetheless, it's there and you ought to consider it. I don't want you to simply step away from it. But some of those, some of that information we'll be able to provide to you. You know, again, and these are some of these. I'm trying to run through it in my head. I think some of the documentation is just publicly available and not necessarily covered by any sort of, you know, employee, consideration per se. Some, I presume, are private and you won't be able to see. We'll do our best, certainly, to provide you with as much information as possible.
Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, for me, I think it boils down to if we can get it, more information on, like you were just saying, why Hodges, if there is any documentation or reasoning or anything that led to that. Was it simply just the DUI? Was it something else? Did the city manager and him have some kind of a disagreement, or what led to that? And then, and then also, reviewing any documentation that was involved with the city manager's hiring. So I think it's pretty hard to render an opinion without that, because again, it does seem that those two items are when it really boils down to the heart of the complaint.
And I think what the city charter says about who has discretion to hire and fire.
Yep.
Because that, I think, is also important to this conversation too, is who had the authority under the charter to fire somebody, who then had the authority to rehire them, or did they have the authority to rehire them, and would that be the ethics violation, or the stuff that happened after that action? And that may also, so that might have been ethical, and what happened after might be unethical. But I would like to see the information in the charter that talks about the governance piece.
This is very helpful, actually. The way I will handle it, and I can't believe I didn't think about it, but I needed apparently this conversation in order to get there. The way I will handle it is like we handle everything else in law, which is I will give you a brief that analyzes it and has supporting documentation attached to it. And I will leave out, obviously, any opinion from me because I must, and leave you to your thoughts as far as conclusions and everything else. But I'll give you a brief and it'll guide you as far as what the issues are, what the facts supporting those issues are, the documents that you seek out, as well as what the law is on the area, both with respect to our ordinance, as well as other laws that come into play, and that's one that I was mentioning just a moment ago with respect to at will employment and things of that nature. I think that, and I'm going to kick myself for not thinking about it ahead of time, but apparently I needed this conversation.
And then also for me, just the appropriateness of the relationships outside of.
Certainly.
Just
Yeah.
the clarification
Yeah,
on that
absolutely.
as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the appropriateness, good point, the appropriateness of the relationships, and then also, if you're in a position of counsel, if you are, obviously it's not nepotism as defined because it's not family, but is there an expectation that you're, I don't recuse yourself from making a
Decisions.
decision on something that, I don't know. I didn't see anywhere in ordinance that would say that that's required, but I might have missed it.
And we have a conflict of interest policy.
We do.
But they usually only cover, business and personal property.
Yeah.
And so maybe that could be a
And-
recommendation to come out of this group as well.
Yeah, and you have obviously the ethics policy itself, not policy, but ordinance itself does deal with that specifically. So, but absolutely, and my hope obviously, I shouldn't say my hope, our hope is obviously that at the end of the process, even this one individual event, that we'll have recommendations just both for the board, for the ordinance, as well as other ordinances that hopefully we can take back to council and have improvements, changes, additions.
Does the ordinance talk about hiring or fire? It doesn't get into that detail, does it?
No, I don't believe it deals with that. It does delve into certain details that have to do with this, but not hiring per se, I don't
It
believe.
doesn't talk about conflicts of interest around this
It does,
policy,
it does talk about conflict of interest, yes.
but not in relation to hiring.
Oh, not in relation to hiring, no.
And what was the quorum on city council during that time? How many people were on council and what was the quorum? Because the vote was 2-1, so the quorum was 3, I guess.
For,
During August, so during the time.
The special meeting when Mike,
with respect to
yes,
termination of the
when
former
two
city
of the
manager.
council members who were appointed, not elected, couldn't vote.
Correct, yeah. We have a provision in the charter that states that only members-elect may vote on the termination of a city manager. That's specific to the point. And 2 of the members of our council currently are appointed. Therefore, only 3 members could vote. So that was 3 would have been quorum, and it would be a 2-1. It was I don't remember, yeah.
It was 2-1.
2-1, yeah,
Yes.
so the vote was, appropriate.
Some of the information is when the interim council had been appointed, because they make reference to a couple of current council people too, and different votes. Because there were a couple things that had been amended and,
They were able to vote after that on all the other aspects.
Right.
The full council was allowed to vote. Only in that specific termination of Mr. Smith did that provision kick in.
But wouldn't that have been a violation of the Open Meetings Act anyways, to add those two agendas that required to be voted on in less than 24 hours and no public notice? Isn't that a violation of OMA? Don't you need to?
What wasn't posted?
Well, it says that Mayor Scripture added those two agenda items.
Oh, no, all you have to post is that there's going to be a meeting. Agenda items are always fluid and move around. That's, the posting Open Meetings Act is there's going to be a meeting held at this time in this place. The subject of the meeting, it always can change. Open Meetings Act is about a public meeting being noticed.
And we don't have anything in the bylaws that require like a supermajority, like such as a decision like hiring or firing?
No,
Charter says, no, there's.
not for that.
Okay, I just wanted to check those two really important things before we go
Sure.
too far. Okay, so is there anything else we want to add to the discussion? And you said we don't need to make a motion, but
No.
I'm guessing that we are unanimously asking to table the conversation, right? Pending further information?
Absolutely.
I applaud you on your proper use of language.
Yes.
I've been on the boards for a while.
Yeah, we live for this.
Yeah.
And if we may, while we have you here, probably some conversation with respect to next date, what may be appropriate. How did this work? Does a day like this, a Wednesday, we've talked about Wednesdays before being the appropriate time. Does this make sense going forward?
I think so, for me.
I will be very honest, Wednesday is very hard for me.
Okay.
I could make a 7:30 work. 7 o'clock is, I'm always going to be coming in this time, which I don't want to do to you all. So it's up to you if we want to continue with this or if there's another day that works better. I know probably not with the council and the,
Yeah, usually, so Tuesdays can be difficult, obviously, because we have council and planning commission alternatively, and so that gets to be a little difficult. August, I'll leave it to you. I'm always going to make myself available, but obviously, what do you?
Are Mondays and
worry about me.
Thursdays not an
Okay.
option?
I'm sorry?
Is Monday or Thursday not an option?
Oh, certainly. Yeah, they're
Sure
entirely
is,
up to you.
it is.
Yeah,
And
sure.
between myself or my deputies, someone can be here no matter what on this end. So all we're doing is writing stuff down here, so.
I would prefer not to be Wednesdays, but
Okay.
I'm open to, I
That's
mean,
two.
if that's what everybody else wants.
I don't have a preference, so I'll, whatever works for you guys.
So maybe we post it for a Monday coming up, and, okay.
Okay,
that works for me.
that works for me
Do
too.
you have a date in mind now? Or do you want us to try to like shoot that around on email?
Yeah, let's hear it over the email, because obviously I'll need some time to be able to, we'll need some time to accumulate the documents as well as prepare, obviously, proper information to be submitted to the board, so.
And I would like to give the complainant enough time to, if there are changes that need to be made to their narrative too. I think that's fair.
And from an administrative standpoint, with what you just said, the complainant, kind of like this board, didn't really know how to present it.
Yeah.
It just kind of.
Absolutely.
Exactly. That's
So
why I
we might want
wanted
to
to be
outline
fair.
a future format
Yeah.
that we'd like to see things, and that's something that probably Renaissance or I would like create a forum for that.
Yeah, we'll create,
So-
we'll create something and present it to you at the next meeting, that one of the agenda items on the next meeting will be exactly that.
Yeah, but then, not necessarily hold that against the complainant this time.
Correct.
Or you just either, or the way that everything's handling, because we're just kind of figuring this out now, so. Just wanted to get that out on the
Thank you.
YouTube record. We're gonna move forward on that.
Okay, so I will then move on to other business, if there is any. I think that might have been other business.
That was
right?
other
Okay,
business.
so then we'll move on to the city attorney's report.
And I don't have any, thank you, I should have done the city attorney report earlier so that I could have had properly that speech, but otherwise, thank you very much.
I love a short meeting, Menace. So, does anyone want to make a motion to adjourn?
I'll motion to adjourn.
I'll second.
Thank you. Thank you for attending this meeting.
Roll call.
Yes, McGinnis is absent, Fenton,
Yes,
McCullough,
Yes.
Traxel.
Yes.
We are adjourned.
Thank you so much.
thank you, everyone.
McCullough.